As a classroom teacher or parent, you can probably list many specific situations in which frustrating behaviors are happening. These would be situations like a student is sleeping during independent work, a child cries and refuses to do their homework once they get home from school, or a child leaves all of their materials that would be necessary to do their homework at school. A student talks continuously and makes noises while the teacher is teaching. A student is up and out of their seat, off task, and distracting other students during transitions. A student who becomes very anxious or has a meltdown when routines change. Or maybe a student who gets in fights or displays angry, explosive behavior during unstructured time, like in the hallway, during independent work, or in the bathroom. When we have specific situations like this, we have three possible solutions. So the first step would be to think of the very specific situation that you have with a student or with your child. And then we always have three possible solutions. The first solution is that we can impose our will. And this means we can try to get them to do what we want them to do. We can try to make them do it. This also involves anything that is like giving a reward or imposing a punishment. The risks here are that it might not work. It also may damage the relationship. The second solution that we have that's a possibility is that we can drop it. And this is more of a strategic choice in that situation. So we're allowing the student or the child to solve the behavior in the way that they want to solve it as a strategic choice. This isn't like when solution number one of imposing our will fails, then we decide to just drop it. That's not what I mean. This is a strategic choice to drop it. And this keeps things calm, but usually the problem continues to exist or to live on. And then the third choice that we have is collaborative problem solving. And this is when the student and the adult, or the child and the adult, work together to solve the problem in a mutually satisfying way. So they're pursuing the thing that we're worried about, trying to solve the problem. We're building the helping relationship. And this is where skills training would happen. So if a student or your child doesn't have certain skills, this is where the adult would be working with the child or the student to teach those skills or that behavior through modeling and scaffolding involved in collaborating to solve a problem. So it's important to point out that you have to choose the plan you want to go with depending on your desired outcome. So different ones of these plans, either option one, which is rewards and punishments or imposing your will, option two, which is dropping it, or option three, which is collaborative problem solving. We're going to choose the solution or the plan we want to go with depending on the outcome that we desire. So with the first one, using rewards and punishments or trying to make them do it somehow, sometimes in some situations that works. Rewards work because life is a mix of intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. You know, we have things that internally motivate us, and sometimes we are not that internally motivated. And how and when you decide to use rewards is so important, as is the feedback or the way that you're presenting the rewards and what you're saying along with giving the reward. So you might decide to use rewards and punishments or solution number one if you only need short-term compliance for some reason. You might also decide to use this for several other reasons. And the reason I say if you only need short-term compliance is because in the long term, rewards have been shown to decrease internal motivation. So if we give out a reward for a specific behavior, like if we say, if you do your homework, I will give you a ticket, and we tie the reward specifically to the behavior, that may cause the student to do that behavior at that particular time because they want their ticket or they want their piece of candy. But it doesn't cause them to develop the internal desire to complete their work. In fact, over time, research has shown that giving out rewards for behavior in that way causes the student's internal motivation to decrease. So that's why I say maybe you could use rewards for short-term compliance if that's all that you need, or you might choose to use a reward or specific praise to, in the short term, to increase a positive behavior that rarely occurs. So say that you have a student where you want to see a particular behavior, but that behavior really doesn't occur very frequently. At first, you might give a reward when that student shows that behavior, or you may give them positive praise. And then you're going to fade the frequency of the reward over time, moving to giving eventually only positive praise, but you want to fade out that reward gradually so that you're not giving it for every single time the behavior is displayed. And then eventually you're switching over to just specific praise. So I don't just mean like great job. This is praise where you're telling the student specifically what they did well in displaying the behavior that you were looking for. And probably along with that praise, the way that the behavior is going to benefit them or the other people around them. And once the behavior is more established and becomes a habit, you would be able to give the reward less frequently, and the idea is to fade the reward over time. You can also use rewards in the classroom where students are in control. Rewards can be given to focus on positive behaviors with feedback instead of as a way to control behavior. So for example, instead of saying, I will give you a ticket when you finish your work, you're saying something like, I see you finished your work correctly and stayed focused. So as a result, you can have the last 15 minutes of class to do an activity of your choice, like have a snack, play a game, like Uno, rest. You would give them some options. Or instead of saying, if you complete your homework, you get a piece of candy, you would say something like, I see you completed your homework every day this week and you did your best work. And as a result, we've practiced all of the concepts we need to practice for this week. And you won't have any homework on Friday because we've already practiced everything that we need to practice. And since you worked so hard, we got it done early. And so you'll have Friday to do whatever you'd like in the evening. We won't have any homework that day. Or another example of where I used rewards in the classroom is I would randomly write positive notes to parents or mail postcards home to recognize students' positive behaviors in class. This technically was a reward, but it was not tied to every instance of behavior because you don't need to reward behavior every time it happens if a student is already choosing to do a behavior. So if a student is choosing to read independently at home, you don't have to reward them every evening for reading independently at home. They're already choosing that behavior, and rewarding it will just decrease their internal motivation to do it. If a student is already displaying a behavior, we don't need to reward it. And then the other thing that we can do is we cannot praise the behavior for doing the behavior for a reward, and instead focus on the other effects of doing the behavior. So for example, we would say, you did a fantastic job thinking about others. The class really appreciates what you did. Instead of something like, you shared your extra snacks, so you'll get a ticket to the prize box. So what we're going to focus on with our feedback is how the behavior affects others positively. instead of focusing on doing the behavior for the reward with our feedback. And in some situations, you might decide to use the second option, which is dropping it as a strategy. I call this planned ignoring, and this works well when a student is testing you or possibly doing something intentionally to see if they can get a rise out of you. It also works for more minor issues because we can't always collaborative problem solve every single issue that comes up. That would take more than the 24 hours that we have in each day. And so we have to pick and choose the problems that we're going to collaborate to problem solve with a student. Similarly, we might choose to deflect or distract from the problem with humor if the issue is minor, and working on it would be more of a disruption than moving on. I may also decide to drop the behavior if it's more of a one-time thing, or if it's out of character for that student or less of a continuous issue. We might chat about it, but we might not need to address it right in that moment and do, more of an intensive problem solving if it's a one-time thing. When we decide to use the third option, which is problem solving, the process has several components. And these three solutions are from the work of Dr. Stuart Ablon, a psychologist from Harvard and who works at the Mass General Hospital in Massachusetts. When you decide to use the problem solving, the process will always have these components. And probably the most important component is to start with empathy and understanding. And I think a lot of times we misunderstand what it means to display empathy. It does not mean that we're jumping in with our perspective, we're not giving our point of view, we're not coming in with our solutions. Approaching a student with empathy means we're trying to understand their perspective. And trying to understand somebody else's perspective is one of the most powerful human regulators. So if a student is very dysregulated, coming in and working with that student, approaching that student with empathy is a way to help that student regulate. And what that might look like is asking questions, taking some educated guesses tentatively, and then checking them. And these are a part of something called reflective listening, which lets people know that you are hearing them. So you are listening for the student's perspective, and then you are reflecting that perspective back to them, perhaps asking some questions and kind of guessing and checking to make sure that you get it right. And then providing reassurance to the child or the student so that they know that you're really trying to listen and understand their perspective, and that you're not just doing a sneaky way of doing solution number one, which is rewards and punishments, or trying to get them to do what you want them to do by making them do it. So they know you're not trying to manipulate them in any way, and that you're actually listening to understand their perspective. After we listen for their perspective, which would sound something like, I know there must be an important reason that you did blah, ... Or I hear that you're saying, and rephrase what they're saying. And with an older student, it might just mean saying what they said to you, but in a different way back to them to check it. And it doesn't have to have the I hear what you're saying, because sometimes that can come across as like a little bit cheesy or whatever. So you're just going to reflect what they're saying back, but say it in a different way and check to see if you got it correct. After you listen to them, you're going to acknowledge that you heard them, and then you're going to share your concern. So at that point, it doesn't mean offering a solution. It means to tell them what you're concerned about, and they would share. So they have shared their concerns with you, their perspective. You are sharing your concerns with them. So at that point, you have both the child and the adult's concerns. And then you're going to basically go in this order. First, you're getting the student regulated. And that's why you're approaching this problem-solving process with empathy, to try to understand their perspective. And then The second step would be to relate. That's where you come in and you tell them your concern, and you've also listened to their concern. And then the third step would be to reason, where the child or the student and the adult or the teacher work on problem solving together and brainstorm solutions. And it's important to remember that the way that we speak to kids as a parent, or most importantly as a parent, but also as a teacher, becomes the way they speak to themselves inside their head. And by doing this, by listening to kids, reassuring them, sharing your concerns, and working together to problem solve, we are teaching them the skills necessary to learn to do this on their own. So remember, kids will do well if they can. Collaborative problem solving is a scaffold that helps students to build the skills necessary to problem solve later on their own.